Hi, I'm John Hyatt, a staff writer at Forbes, and I'm here with my colleague Giacomo Tognini, and we're here to talk about our article, How Jeffrey Epstein Got So Rich. Hey, Giacomo, how are you today?
Good, John. How are you?
Good. So let's start high level. Who was Jeffrey Epstein, and how did he make his fortune, and what was the size of his fortune when he died in 2019?
All right. So, as is pretty well known, Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender and a wealthy financier. And what we know about how much he was worth when he died, we know from his estate, which put out a filing after his death in August 2019. And his net worth in that statement was around $578 million. Much of that was sort of in cash, investments in private equity, hedge funds, and stocks and various things like that. And in terms of how he got rich, there's obviously a lot that we don't know, but the crux of our article that we wrote together, right, was sort of digging into what we do know, what's out there from court filings and various, financial records. And so we know, thanks to, in large part, to these financial records that were obtained by a public records request from the New York Times a few years ago that looked into Epstein's firms in the U.S. Virgin Islands, that he generated more than $800 million in revenue between 1999 and 2018, which was sort of the most prolific part of his, of his activities, basically, with his financial sort of advice. Largely, we know that he gave, tax and estate planning advice to wealthy clients. And what's interesting from these financial records is that there's two companies he had there in the U.S. Virgin Islands where he was based. And out of sort of all of that income you brought in, 490 million, at least, could be more, because there's some years we don't have access to, came from client fees, right? So fees he was bringing in for advising his clients on, like I mentioned, trust and estate planning, tax, and sort of various things of that nature. And we also know from an expert report in a court case filed by the U.S. Virgin Islands against J.P. Morgan Chase, which was one of the banks that did business with Epstein, that these two entities that, we looked at the financial records for, they were the only revenue-generating entities that Epstein had in that period. So, of course, other things we don't know, but I think we're able to sort of see, okay, in this 19-year period, right up until he died, he brought in more than 800 million in revenue. Let's say close to 500 million was in client fees, which were from these services we spoke about. And that's really sort of the crux of his fortune. We also know that he pulled out, about 360 million or more in dividends from the businesses in that time. And that sort of, sets the stage for, how he was able to amass close to $600 million fortune by the time he died. And, sort of passing it back to you, given what we know about sort of how much you brought in, what were the primary sources of the wealth, and sort of who are his biggest clients that we do know about?
Now, Lex Wexner and Leon Black have not been accused of wrongdoing in connection to Jeffrey Epstein's alleged sex trafficking crimes. Both have apologized for their association with Jeffrey Epstein and have said that they would not have done business with him had they known the extent of his criminal activity. So we know that he had two really big clients. These were sort of his anchor clients at various points in his career. The first was Les Wexner, who is the founder of the company formerly called The Limited, which was the parent company of well-known retailers like Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, Abercrombie Fitch. Les Wexner was Jeffrey Epstein's number one client from the early 1990s until 2007. We estimate that he paid Jeffrey Epstein over $200 million in fees over the course of their relationship. The Wall Street Journal came out with a similar estimate, citing sources familiar with the matter, of at least $200 million paid by Wexner to Jeffrey Epstein. And then his second big client was Leon Black. Leon Black is a co-founder and former CEO of Apollo Global Management, which is one of the largest private equity firms in the world. Both Mr. Wexner and Mr. Black are billionaires, and these two were really central to Jeffrey Epstein's money-making activities. Mr. Black paid Jeffrey Epstein, $170 million in client fees between 2012 and 2017. So just behind Mr. Wexner in terms of total amount of money paid to Jeffrey Epstein. There's a lot we don't know, though, about who Jeffrey Epstein's clients were. We know that a hedge fund billionaire, Glenn Dubin, his hedge fund paid $15 million to Jeffrey Epstein for introducing it to JP Morgan for a later deal that happened between those two financial institutions. We know that the Johnson & Johnson heiress, Elizabeth Johnson, was a client. We don't know how much she paid him. And so in terms of that nearly $500 million in client fees number that we have, we know that Wexner paid at least $200 million, or at least we estimate that. We know Leon Black paid $170 million, according to a report authored by a law firm that investigated those payments. We know that Glenn Dubin's firm paid $15 million, but that leaves over $100 million in client fees that we still don't know where that money came from. We don't know who those clients of Jeffrey Epstein were who were paying him, and we don't know for what services they were paying him. Presumably, they were similar tax and estate planning services, financial advice, money management types of services that Epstein offered Wexner and Mr. Leon Black, but there's a lot we don't know there. And so kicking it to you, let's dive in a bit further on Lex Wexner, Jeffrey Epstein's most important client. When did their relationship begin, and what did Jeffrey Epstein do for Les Wexner, and what ultimately happened with their relationship?
They met in the early 1980s for the first time. At the time, Wexner was already a successful retail mogul. I believe he was already a billionaire at that time. And at the time, Epstein had recently been working at Bear Stearns. And so, initially they got to know each other. Well, we know that initially Wexner hired him to sort of manage his private fortune. And then over time, basically Epstein got control over all of Wexner's finances. By 1991, he held power of attorney over Wexner's finances.
Full control over his finances.
Full control, exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. And then, on top of that $200 million that we talked about, which is basically sort of looking at what we know, that basically looking at the client fees that Epstein pulled in that period when Wexner was still working with him. Wexner said he cut ties off with Epstein in 2007. So sort of before that, 99 to 07, we don't really know much about before then. But even before that, before we started tracking the finances, they also had a very deep relationship, right? 1991 onwards, Epstein was handling all of his finances. We know, for example, that in the late 90s, Epstein was already living in Wexner's 28,000 square foot, 7-story mansion on the Upper East Side.
The infamous Manhattan townhouse.
Exactly, right. And then Wall Street Journal's reported that Epstein purchased it for $20 million in 1998. But if you actually look at the deed records, it was only transferred formally to Epstein in 2011. So, showing sort of the length of that relationship. Epstein had also bought a home for $3.5 million in the 90s in New Albany, which is a sort of large planned community that Wexner has been really instrumental in developing and growing in Central Ohio. He then later flipped it in the late 90s to a company associated with Wexner. And actually at that time in 1998, Epstein was a director of the New Albany company, which is Wexner's company that developed the entire area. So this really sort of goes to show how intertwined they were. Another thing is Epstein owned many jets. One of them, a Boeing 727, which has been nicknamed the Lolita Express for its use in the alleged crimes that Epstein committed. That had actually also been initially purchased by Wexner and his company Limited, and then transferred to Epstein in 2001. And so all this goes up to 2007 when, Wexner says that he cut off ties. He says that he had found that Epstein had misappropriated at least for $46 million in funds. Now, this also sort of coincides with a fallow time for Epstein, as we're going to go into.
Yeah, what happened?
So at that point, right, let's go back to the finances. We have clarity over 1999 to 2018, right? 1999 to 2007, Epstein's firm in the U.S. Virgin Islands, it's called Financial Trust Company. It's doing phenomenally well, bringing in tens of millions of dollars per year. In 2004, it was its best year. That was the year it got the fee from Highbridge, for the merger, for the acquisition offer from J.P. Morgan. That was its best year. Keeps doing great. '07, Wexner cuts off ties. The financial crisis hits, and then Epstein's firm, Financial Trust, has 5 straight years through 2012 of continuous net losses in the tens of millions of dollars. We tallied it up, and over those 5 years, it was 166 million in collective net losses.
Wow. So he loses Wexner as a client, and he immediately starts losing money.
Right. And if you just look at the client fees, right, because that's where we're looking at here, '08 to 2012, he pulls in only $400,000 in client fees.
Wow.
In the previous 5 years, '03 to '08, he brought in more than $200 million. So this really shows, we don't know exactly, like you mentioned, how much Wexner was paying him, but we can see this, dramatic fall off. And, part of it is the investment losses, right? Because he was an investor and it was the financial crisis, but also clearly his fee income collapsed, right? And that's where we can see the loss, likely the loss of Wexner as a major client.
Okay.
And so, another, obviously, an event that should have had a major impact on his reputation was that in 2008, he pleaded guilty to 2 felony prostitution-related charges in Florida.
Mm.
Now, as we're going to talk about, that didn't, prevent him from continuing to operate and continue to make money, but that sort of coincided with this time period where he lost Wexner as a client and then the financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But, going into that, after that, as we know, he gained a new client, Leon Black.
Mm-hmm.
So how did he help revive Epstein's fortunes after this period of losses?
Right. So Leon Black and Jeffrey Epstein had already known each other for over a decade. The two met in the 1990s. They were apparently close because Jeffrey Epstein was a director of Leon Black's family foundation. This is his charity through which he's dispensing money to various philanthropic initiatives. Epstein was a director of Leon Black's foundation from the late 90s until 2007. And so the two already knew each other, but they apparently weren't engaged in any business together. That is until 2012, at which point the two somehow reconnect, and Leon Black pays Jeffrey Epstein an initial $5.5 million for tax and estate planning services. The two parties sign a contract and agree to participate in sort of a larger business relationship in which Jeffrey Epstein is providing estate, tax planning, financial advice, all sorts of different sort of money management, money advice services to Mr. Leon Black.
That's in 2013, right, when they signed that contract and there's those larger payments.
That's right. So there's the initial $5.5 million payment in 2012. 2013, they signed the contract. $50 million flows from Leon Black to Jeffrey Epstein in 2013. Then $70 million the next year in 2014. 70, not 17, 70 from Leon Black to Jeffrey Epstein in 2014. Then another, I believe it's $40 million in 2015. And so this is a lot of money, obviously, for financial advice. You don't typically see sums this large for tax and estate planning services. In 2016, no payments on record. And then in 2017, there's a final payment. And then the two parties ultimately part ways in 2018. So ultimately, Leon Black paid Jeffrey Epstein $170 million in client fees. That's according to an independent investigation done by the law firm Deckert, which was hired by Apollo and Mr. Black to conduct a thorough analysis into the relationship of Leon Black and Jeffrey Epstein. That report did not find any evidence of wrongdoing from Mr. Black in connection to Jeffrey Epstein's alleged sex crimes and sex trafficking. It found that those payments were for legitimate estate and tax planning services. Questions remain, though, just about why the fees were so large. What's interesting also is that it wasn't just client fees that Leon Black was paying Jeffrey Epstein. In 2015, Leon Black also gave $10 million to one of Jeffrey Epstein's charities. As you and some of the viewers may recall, during this period, Jeffrey Epstein was really trying to resurrect his public image. He had lost Wexner as a client. It was also known that he had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of crimes in Florida and was a registered sex offender. And so he was trying to revive his image. Charities, foundations, gifts to other charities were part of his resurrection campaign. And so Leon Black supported that with a $10 million payment. And interestingly, Leon Black also lent a company held by Jeffrey Epstein
called Plan D LLC, right?
Plan D LLC. He lent this entity $30 million, just over $30 million. According to the Deckert report, Leon Black thought this money was in connection to an art deal that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in. In reality, this company, Plan D, owned a Gulf Stream that was transporting young women and girls to one of Jeffrey Epstein's islands where the alleged sex crimes, some of the alleged sex crimes took place. And ultimately, Jeffrey Epstein only paid back, I believe it was $8 or $10 million.
$10 million, right? And, we don't know if Plan D owned other assets, but what we do know is that it was the entity that owned that plane, which was involved in that, right?
That's right. That's right. And so ultimately, sort of similar to the breakup between Epstein and Wexner over alleged misappropriation of money, according to the Deckert report, Black and Epstein ultimately parted ways because Epstein wouldn't pay back the full $30 million loan. He only paid back $10 million. So he still owed $20 million to Leon Black before at the time he was indicted by federal authorities and then died by suicide in 2019. And so Leon Black was extremely important to this sort of second act that Jeffrey Epstein had, right? After the financial crisis, after he initially pleaded guilty, he was able to resurrect his business career thanks almost exclusively to Leon Black. The court, the financial statements that you analyzed, which were, obtained in that New York Times, FOIA lawsuit, show that Jeffrey Epstein was almost entirely dependent on fees from Leon Black between 2012 and 2017.
In some years, I think we looked at Black's fees made up 100% of the fee income for his company at the time, which had by then changed to Southern Trust, right? But there's, I think, 2 or 3 years where 100% of that fee income came from Black's payments, right?
Right. That's exactly it. And it's so interesting, right? Because Jeffrey Epstein always styled himself as the tycoon, the financial tycoon who managed money for a lot of different billionaires. But when we really dug into the numbers, we see that 2 billionaires were really his sort of anchor clients. It was Wexner and it was Black. But obviously these 2 were central to his fortune that he ultimately amassed by the time he died, close to $600 million. But there's also this element, this tax element of Jeffrey Epstein registering his businesses in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Talk to us about how that played a role in his ability to grow his wealth.
All right, so Epstein became a resident of the U.S. Virgin Islands in 1996. The U.S. Virgin Islands are U.S. territory in the Caribbean, and he becomes a resident in 1996. 2 years later, in 1998, he purchases Little St. James Island, which has come to be known since then as Pedophile Island for the alleged sex crimes that took place there, that Epstein allegedly committed there. And in 1998, the same year, he sets up a company called Financial Trust Company. So he'd had this sort of financial advisory, tax and estate planning firm already in Florida before, but then he sets this up in 1998, and he applies for a program called the Economic Development Commission, EDC program in the USVI. And basically, it offers exemptions of 90% on corporate income tax and 100% on excise and gross taxes to businesses that fulfill a set of requirements. Largely, they need to have at least, I believe, 10 full-time residents, full-time U.S. Virgin Islands residents as employees with the company, and invest $100,000 in a local business, to advance sort of local economic development. We know from the records, both that the New York Times obtained and also from court records in the lawsuit between the U.S. Virgin Islands government and J.P. Morgan Chase, that Epstein obtained those benefits. He held them, through, I believe it was from 1999 to 2009. Then he got them extended. Then in 2012, he set up a new firm called Southern Trust, which effectively just sort of took over from the previous one. And then he got those benefits extended again for 10 years, ultimately until he died. And what we know is that he obtained about $300 million in tax benefits over that time. That's sort of an official calculation from the U.S. Virgin Islands government. If you look at the tax filings each year, which were in that lawsuit that I mentioned. And we also know that he only paid about $41 million in that period, 1999 to 2018. So, if you crunch the numbers, it comes out to, about a 4% tax rate, when throughout most of that period, through 2018, the U.S. Virgin Islands was charging a, top corporate income tax rate of 38.5%. So these were tremendous tax benefits that he was gaining, right? Of course, he couldn't have done that without the billionaire backers we spoke to, the $170 million from Leon Black, according to the Deckard report, and the, further research by the Senate Finance Committee, the, more than $200 million from Wexner and the other fees we've talked about. But he was able to collect so much money tax-free. We talked about the dividends he pocketed before, $360 million in dividends. And he was able to sort of keep growing this, keep investing this money, posting these investment gains and growing that fortune, in large part also thanks to these tremendous tax benefits in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
The effective tax rate that he paid on, what was it, like 3 or 4%?
4%, right? About 4%, compared to 38.5% top rate for most of that time. So, tremendous tax savings there.
It's incredible, extraordinary. I mean, and far less than what the average American pays on their federal income tax.
Right. And, even since President Trump lowered those tax rates in 2018, the top rate has come down a bit since then. This is still, far, far lower than those rates are now. And, if we look at sort of the, these three pillars, right, of how he built his wealth that we've looked at in our story and have talked about today, you've got first Les Wexner as the main client, then Leon Black, after that period in, around the financial crisis and when he was, when he pleaded guilty to those two charges, and then Leon Black. And then you put in these tax benefits throughout that time that allow him to amass and accumulate this wealth. What do you think it is about Epstein and sort of his appeal to billionaires, or sort of that billionaire clientele? Like, what was it about? How important was that to him? And how did he sort of talk about it in trying to win over these wealthy clients?
All reports suggest that he was an incredibly charismatic person when he was interacting with billionaires and powerful people. He did exude a certain confidence and energy that really won over these billionaire clients. He styled himself as a very talented commodities and currencies trader. It's unclear the extent to which he was a successful trader. We know he had a career at Bear Stearns, but that rather ignominiously ended in scandal before he signed up Wexner. We didn't even get into this, but before he signed up Wexner as a client, he was tied to a sort of con artist who was running a Ponzi scheme. Ultimately, Epstein, testified in a case against that person, but was never charged. And so he really sort of projected this air and this confidence that won over these clients. And these clients not only paid him tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, but they helped Jeffrey Epstein ingratiate himself with others like them, right? He was really, whether it was him in the New York townhouse, whether it was, him, flying people to his islands in the Caribbean or on his private jet, he really did project that he was himself a billionaire, even if the financial records obtained upon his death reveal that he was not a billionaire. Yes, he was extremely wealthy, but he was not in the same league as some of his clients. But he projected that lifestyle and he projected that confidence. And that was in large part why he was able to not just win over clients and win their business, but perhaps more importantly for his sake, win over powerful friends. I mean, this is somebody who was good friends with Donald Trump in the 1990s and early 2000s before they broke. He was good friends with Bill Clinton. After, Bill Clinton's presidency ended, he flew with Jeffrey Epstein and on his plane several times. He was friends with luminaries like Larry Summers, Alan Dershowitz. I mean, you name it, Jeffrey Epstein built a relationship with these people, and you have to imagine that those powerful relationships helped him withstand scrutiny. into his sex crimes. And so, I think it does sort of tell a larger tale of what power and members of elite institutions, what those relationships can do and how they can mask who somebody truly is. But it also shows, what the power of money can do to make people blind to things that are happening in front of them. If Jeffrey Epstein is, allegedly a financial mastermind who's going to grow your portfolio and build you wealth, you might overlook what should be glaringly obvious, that he's constantly surrounded by young women, girls, that he engages in dubious activities, that, something is not right with this character. And so I think there is a larger narrative here about, the blindness of the elite and what the pursuit of wealth can ultimately cause.
Right. And it's also hard to sort of, when you see these sums, right, to think, how valuable could his advice really have been? Like, I know in the Deckard report, Black, estimated that Epstein's advice saved him, $1 to $2 billion, I believe, in, $1 to $2 billion in sort of estate taxes or other sort of taxes. But sort of from the, research we've looked at and sort of experts have spoken about this before, these seem like enormous amounts of money he's pulling in from these people, right, for these services. Not that, maybe the services were actually helpful, these tax services, but sort of the extent to which he's, enriching himself is pretty unusual, right? And I think at one point he mentioned to Black that he usually charged clients $40 million, right? Which we don't know. Could be true. We only know sort of a few clients, but then decided to charge Black only $23.5 million initially, right? And that he only worked with billionaires, right? It's going to your point of he was projecting this, this idea of I only work with the wealthiest people. I charge this much, and maybe partly it was true, but it was definitely part of that air he was building for himself, right?
Right. And the math that you did on the payments he got from Wexner, his anchor client before he signed up Black, indicate he was not charging Wexner, his main client, $40 million a year, right? Wouldn't it average out to closer to $20 million?
Right. And we also don't know what was happening before 1999, right? So it seems unlikely considering their relationship at the very least went back to early 80s, but sort of in terms of his actual financial control, 1991, right? So that's a whole other 10 years plus that we don't have visibility over to that point.
Right. And to that point, there's so much we still don't have visibility on. That additional $100+ million in client fees, where was that money coming from? And that sort of goes to, what Senator Ron Wyden has been doing in the Senate, tracking down payments in and out of Jeffrey Epstein's bank accounts. Talk to us a bit about that and sort of what we can look for on that front and what we might learn if that information gets out.
Right. So last week, Senator Wyden, who's on the Senate Finance Committee, which, as we mentioned before, has been doing more research on the amounts of money that Black paid Epstein. He put out this letter, and he also spoke with the New York Times, and basically he revealed that early last year, in 2024, some investigators from the Senate Finance Committee were able to look at these files in the Treasury Department on Epstein's finances and transactions in and out of his bank accounts. They were only able to take notes and weren't able to take any of them with them. But what they did reveal was that there was more than 4,700 transactions from 4 banks. So that's JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, BNY Mellon, and Deutsche Bank. That show, 4,700 transactions with Epstein's bank accounts at these banks that totaled at least $1.9 billion. Now, much of that could be the funds we've already spoken about, but that's such an enormous amount that it really makes you think that there's more there that we need to investigate. Senator Wyden has really publicly called for this. He sent a letter to Attorney General Pam Bondi urging her to investigate, her and the DOJ and the Treasury Department to, if not make these files public, to dedicate a team to investigate them, because there could be more information in those, right, about who the other clients were. There's also suggestions that Epstein had links to Russian banks that have since been sanctioned, which could be tied to a potential sex trafficking ring he had in Eastern Europe tied to his alleged sex trafficking operation. So not just on sort of his client base, but on everything else that we know about him and these crimes that he was being investigated for, there could be a lot more information in those documents that haven't been investigated yet. And so now that there is so much renewed public interest in this case, I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops, whether there is an investigation into those Treasury Department files. Who knows, perhaps there isn't that much information there either, but to Senator Wyden's point, it seems worth investigating and getting at least more resources put into that.
Absolutely. Well, this story's not going away anytime soon. Thank you, Giacomo.
Thanks, John.